Have you ever had a moment where life stops, even for a second, and you realize something or someone was meant to change everything? The city pulsed with restless life that evening. Glass towers shimmered in fading sunlight, headlights streaked across crowded streets, and horns blared in impatient rhythm. Among the noise and motion, a sleek black car cut through traffic with effortless grace. Its tinted windows and gleaming frame marked it instantly, a car that belonged to power. Inside sat Daniel Hayes, 35 years old, handsome with neatly kept brown hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of presence that silenced rooms before he spoke. To the world, Daniel was the definition of success. A billionaire whose fortune had been built on precision, discipline, and a refusal to ever lose. To those who envied him, he was untouchable. But in truth, Daniel lived in silence far heavier than the city's noise, a silence no amount of wealth could fill. Another gala waited for him that night, another ballroom lit by chandeliers and filled with empty conversations and polished laughter. It was the rhythm of his life now, a rhythm he followed without purpose. And then his eyes shifted, his world shifted. On the corner of a quieter street, he saw a small figure, a boy, no older than 5, with blonde hair tousled under the glow of a flickering street lamp. He sat on the curb, his little shoulders trembling, his hands covering his face. His small frame shook as sobs escaped him, raw and unguarded. Daniel leaned forward, instinct telling him to ignore it. A child crying, it wasn't his business. And yet, something about the boy's presence unsettled him. The sight clawed at something buried deep within him. "Stop the car," Daniel said suddenly. The driver looked back, startled. "Sir, stop," Daniel repeated, his voice sharper this time. The car slowed to the curb. Daniel stepped out, the evening air cool against his face, his shoes clicking against the pavement. For a man used to control, the decision to approach felt strangely reckless. But his feet carried him anyway. The boy hadn't noticed him yet, still crying quietly, his blonde head bowed. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Hey," he said, his deep voice gentler than usual. "Are you all right?" The boy lifted his head, startled. His tear-streaked face turned upward, revealing wide blue eyes filled with fear and helplessness. Daniel froze for a moment. Something about those eyes struck him, something eerily familiar, though he couldn't place why. The boy stammered between shaky breaths. "My mom, she's sick. I didn't know what to do." Daniel felt something tighten inside his chest. He wasn't supposed to care. But the trembling in that little voice, the sight of those small tears, it cut through him in a way no business failure ever had. He crouched down, lowering himself to the child's level. "What's your name?" "Alexander," the boy whispered. "Alexander," Daniel repeated slowly, as though committing it to memory. His own name carried weight across the city. But this name felt heavy in a different way. "Where's your mother now?" The boy lifted a small hand and pointed down the dimly lit street. "She's home. She told me not to cry, but I was scared." Before we continue, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know who's joining us for this story. Daniel followed the boy's gaze, the outline of worn houses visible at the far end of the road. He hesitated. Logic told him to walk away. He had no place in this. But then Alexander's small hand reached for his, clutching it tightly. Daniel froze. For years, every hand extended toward him came with expectation. Money, power, favors. But this boy, this touch was different. Innocent, uncalculated, real. And so Daniel Hayes, the man who commanded empires, did not pull away. He let the boy guide him forward, step by step, down the quiet street, not knowing that waiting for him at the end was Sarah, the woman he once loved, the woman he had lost, and the truth that would change everything. The street grew quieter the further they walked, Alexander's tiny hand gripping Daniel's firmly, as if afraid he might vanish if he let go. The billionaire kept his pace steady, glancing down occasionally at the little boy by his side. For reasons he couldn't quite name, the warmth of that small hand in his own unsettled him. He wasn't used to it. Daniel Hayes was used to firm handshakes, practiced smiles, and the cold touch of signed contracts. Not this. Not the fragile trust of a 5-year-old boy who had no reason to believe in him, yet did. Alexander, Daniel said softly, almost testing the name again. How long has your mom been sick? The boy's blonde head tilted down, his lip trembling. A while, he whispered. Sometimes she can't get out of bed. She says it's nothing, but she coughs a lot and she gets tired. She tells me not to worry. But I don't like when she can't smile. Daniel felt something twist inside him. The boy's words, innocent yet heavy, carried the weight of responsibility far too large for such small shoulders. He remembered, faintly, a younger version of himself, before money, before empires, standing in a dim kitchen, hearing his own mother reassure him when she was far too tired herself. Memories he locked away suddenly stirred, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt that same ache he thought he'd buried. They walked past a flickering streetlight, the glow catching Alexander's tear-stained cheeks. Daniel slowed his pace and crouched down, his brown eyes meeting the boy's. And you came out here all alone? At night? Alexander nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. I thought maybe someone could help us. People always walked past, but no one stopped. The words hit harder than Daniel expected. He clenched his jaw, his gaze lingering on the boy's small, hopeful face. In his world, people didn't stop. They pushed forward, cold and determined, ignoring everything that didn't serve them. That had been Daniel's way too, until tonight. You did the right thing, Alexander, Daniel said quietly, his voice low but steady. You're very brave. The boy sniffled again, but a faint flicker of pride lit his expression at those words. Brave. No one had called him that before. Daniel stood again, straightening his suit, but the weight on his chest remained. He wasn't sure why he felt so invested, why he couldn't just hand the boy off to a neighbor and walk away. This wasn't who he was. And yet, every time Alexander's small hand tightened around his own, he found himself less willing to let go. They turned a corner, and Daniel saw it. A narrow, weathered house at the end of the block. Its porch light flickered weakly, and the paint on the front door had long since begun to peel. A stark contrast of the marble halls and glass towers he was accustomed to. That's home, Alexander said quietly, pointing with his free hand. His voice was softer now, as if carrying a secret. Daniel slowed his steps. A strange unease washed over him, not of danger, but of recognition. Something about this house, this path, stirred memories he didn't want to confront. The boy's voice broke the silence again. Mister, will you help her? Daniel looked down, caught off guard. In Alexander's wide, watery eyes, there was no calculation, no demand, just raw hope. The kind of hope that was both fragile and unshakable at once. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. This wasn't his life. He had built walls high enough to keep out everyone and everything that threatened to pull him back into the past. And yet, here he was, standing on a quiet street, holding the hand of a child who shouldn't matter to him, but somehow did. Yes, Daniel said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I'll help her. Alexander's face lit up with relief, and before Daniel could stop himself, he felt the boy's small arms wrap around his leg in a quick, grateful hug. Daniel stiffened, unprepared for the gesture. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with such simple, unguarded gratitude. For a man who lived in a world of pretense, it was almost unbearable. And then, as the boy pulled back, Daniel noticed something else. The way Alexander's eyes glimmered, the shape of his small chin, even the faint curve of his smile, however tired it was. Daniel couldn't place it, but something about this child felt familiar. He shook the thought away as Alexander tugged his hand again. Come on, the boy urged softly. I'll take you to her. Daniel allowed himself to be led up the narrow walkway. His chest tightened with every step toward the house. He didn't know why, but instinct told him this moment would change everything. And deep down, a small part of him, the part he never let anyone see, was afraid. Because Daniel Hayes, the man who had faced ruthless rivals and conquered empires without blinking, suddenly realized he wasn't ready for whatever he was about to find behind that door. The house stood silent at the end of the walkway, its porch light flickering weakly as though it, too, were running out of strength. Daniel paused at the door, his heartbeat unusually loud in his ears. He told himself this was just another act of charity, a favor to a desperate boy. Nothing more. But something deep in his chest refused to believe that. Alexander let go of his hand and scurried forward, his small fingers fumbling with the doorknob. The old hinges groaned as the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit living room inside. The air smelled faintly of chamomile tea and the sharper undertone of medicine. "Mom," the boy called softly, his voice trembling with both fear and excitement. "I brought someone." Daniel stepped across the threshold, his polished shoes meeting the worn wooden floorboards. The room was modest, almost fragile in its simplicity. A small couch, a table stacked with unopened mail, a few toys tucked neatly into the corner. It wasn't poverty exactly, it was survival. And then he saw her. At first, just a silhouette in the half-light of the adjoining room. A woman sitting up slowly from the edge of a narrow bed, her hand bracing herself against the frame. Blonde hair, a little tangled from rest, fell softly around her shoulders. Her frame looked thinner than it should have, fragile in a way that tugged at him instantly. She lifted her head, and when her eyes met his, time seemed to stop. "Sarah." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His heart clenched as though it had been waiting years for this single moment. The years melted away in an instant, pulling him back to days when laughter had filled his world, when her smile had been the brightest thing he knew. And now, here she was, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had lost. Her face was paler than he remembered, her beauty dimmed not by age but by hardship. Yet to him, she was exactly as she had always been, breathtaking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, trembling with the weight of everything left unsaid. "Sarah," Daniel's voice cracked, softer than he intended. Her lips parted, her blue eyes widening in disbelief. For a second, she looked almost afraid, as though seeing a ghost. Her fingers gripped the blanket tightly, her knuckles pale. "Daniel," she whispered. His name trembled on her lips like something she hadn't allowed herself to say in years. Alexander's innocent voice broke the heavy stillness. "Mom, this is the man who helped me. I was crying, and he stopped. He said he'll help you." The boy turned, his small face bright with trust, completely unaware of the storm raging in the air between his mother and Daniel. Sarah blinked quickly, as though grounding herself. Her gaze darted from her son back to Daniel. Her breathing hitched, a quiet gasp escaping her. She looked fragile, vulnerable, and yet there was steel in her eyes too. "Why are you here?" she asked finally, her tone tight, defensive. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. What explanation could he give? That fate had pulled him down the street? That he hadn't been able to ignore the crying child, their child? He swallowed hard, his mind racing. "I didn't know," he said slowly, almost pleading with her eyes to understand. "I didn't know it was you." Sarah's jaw tensed. She pressed a hand against her chest, steadying her breath. It was as though years of carefully built walls had cracked in the span of seconds. The air between them was alive with everything they hadn't said, regrets, anger, longing. Daniel's gaze flicked briefly to Alexander, standing proudly between them, looking up at his mother with wide, hopeful eyes. The boy had no idea the history that hung heavy in the room. Daniel's heart pounded harder. He had built an empire by facing ruthless men without flinching. But standing in Sarah's living room, looking into her eyes after so many years, he felt undone. Sarah finally turned her attention back to her son. She forced a small smile, fragile but warm. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a hand over Alexander's blonde hair. Then her gaze snapped back to Daniel, sharper now. "You shouldn't be here." Her words cut, cold but shaky. They weren't the words of a woman who didn't care. They were the words of someone who cared far too much and had been hurt for it. Daniel's chest tightened. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, but he stayed silent. For the first time in years, Daniel Hayes, the man who always had the perfect words, was speechless. And in that silence, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. He had just stepped back into the life of the only woman he had ever truly loved, and she wanted nothing to do with him. Silence weighed heavy in the small room, the kind of silence that carried history. Sarah kept her gaze low, her hand resting protectively on Alexander's shoulder, while Daniel stood motionless by the doorway, his heart still thundering. For both of them, the moment cracked open a door they had fought to keep locked. And behind that door was their story. Years ago, long before Daniel Hayes became the billionaire whose name commanded headlines, he had simply been a man with ambition and a heart that belonged to her. He met Sarah on an ordinary summer afternoon. She had been 21 then, golden-haired, her laughter filling the air like music. Daniel remembered the way the sun caught her hair, how her eyes sparkled with curiosity and kindness. She wasn't impressed by his talk of ambition or wealth. Unlike everyone else he knew, Sarah wanted something real, something simple. And for the first time in his life, Daniel wanted that too. They spent evenings walking under street lamps, talking about dreams. Sarah had wanted to teach, to make a difference in children's lives. Daniel had wanted to build something lasting, not just wealth, but a legacy. Together, they had painted a future full of hope, hand in hand, believing love was enough to carry them through anything. But life had other plans. As Daniel's career began to rise, so did the demands. Late nights, constant travel, endless meetings. Sarah waited for him, always patient, always believing he would come back to her with the same warmth he had once carried. But slowly, the man who laughed under those street lamps was buried beneath ambition. Arguments crept in like shadows. Sarah longed for time, for presence, for Daniel to remember that love wasn't built on money or power. Daniel, blinded by his need to prove himself, dismissed her pleas as distractions. He told himself it was for her, for them, but every missed dinner, every broken promise, chipped away at what they had. The night it all shattered still haunted him. It had been raining. Sarah had waited at their apartment with a simple dinner, candles lit, hoping to remind him of what mattered. But Daniel hadn't shown. Hours later, when he finally walked through the door, soaked from the storm, his phone still buzzing with calls, her eyes told him everything. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. And though he wanted to beg, to argue, to explain, his pride stopped him. He let her walk away, telling himself it was her choice, not his mistake. But in the years that followed, as his empire grew taller, so did the emptiness inside him. Every success felt hollow. Every crowd felt lonely. And in the quiet of night, when the city was asleep, he thought of her, always her. Now, standing in her home, seeing her fragile but still radiant, Daniel felt those years collapse into nothing. Sarah finally spoke, her voice low but sharp with memory. "You don't belong here, Daniel. You chose your world a long time ago, and I chose to survive without you." Daniel swallowed hard, guilt pressing against his chest. "Sarah," his voice faltered, "I never stopped." "Don't," she cut him off quickly, her eyes glistening but fierce. "Don't say things you don't mean. Not in front of him." Her hand tightened on Alexander's shoulder. The boy looked between them curiously, sensing tension but not understanding it. His innocence was a shield, protecting him from the storm that brewed in his mother's heart. Daniel's gaze lingered on Alexander, then back to Sarah. The resemblance struck him again, the shape of the boy's jaw, the faint curve of the smile. A suspicion flickered in Daniel's mind, one he dared not voice. "Not yet." He drew a quiet breath, his voice softer. "I was wrong, Sarah. I thought building everything else would mean something, but it never did. None of it mattered without." He stopped himself, swallowing the rest. Sarah's eyes glimmered, but she turned away, refusing to let him see her break. And in that fragile silence, both of them knew. No matter how far they had run, no matter how many years had passed, neither had truly escaped their past. The night after their reunion, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, the city lights flickering against the glass. For the first time in years, business didn't matter. Meetings, contracts, mergers, they all fell hollow. All he could see was Sarah's pale face and Alexander's small, tearful eyes. He remembered the boy's cough, the way his tiny shoulders shook, the way Sarah's arms tightened protectively around him. She had looked exhausted, almost fragile, but she never let go of her strength in front of her son. Daniel's chest ached. He had spent years conquering boardrooms, building towers that touched the skyline, buying everything he thought he wanted. But standing in Sarah's small apartment, he realized he had missed the one thing he could never buy back: family. And so, quietly, he decided, if Sarah wouldn't let him close, he would help from a distance. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of knocking at her door. When she opened it, a package sat on the step. Inside was medicine, exactly the brand and dosage she'd been struggling to afford for Alexander's condition. There was no note, no name, but she knew. Her chest tightened as she clutched the bottle. Daniel, part of her wanted to slam the door on his kindness, to reject any reminder of the man who had broken her heart. But another part, the mother inside her, knew she couldn't let pride get in the way of her son's health. She pressed the bottle to her chest, whispering a soft, "Thank you," even if he would never hear it. Over the days that followed, Daniel became a silent presence in their lives. The landlord, who had been threatening Sarah with eviction, suddenly announced her rent was handled. The grocery shop down the street began sending over small deliveries, fresh fruit, milk, bread, paid for in advance. Alexander's worn shoes were replaced by a new pair, left carefully at the doorstep. Sarah knew it was him. She didn't have to ask. And every act of kindness made her heart both soften and ache. One evening, she found Alexander playing with a small toy car that hadn't been there the day before. He was laughing, pushing across the floor, his cheeks flushed with joy. "Where'd you get that, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Alexander looked up, grinning. "It was outside the door, Mommy. Maybe an angel left it for me." Sarah's eyes stung. She turned away before her son could see the tears sliding down her cheeks. Daniel wasn't an angel, not in her memories, but in her son's eyes, he was becoming something close. Meanwhile, Daniel kept his distance, but every chance he got, he drove past their street. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of Alexander chasing pigeons on the sidewalk, or Sarah carrying groceries up the steps. Those moments were bittersweet. He wanted to step out, to laugh with them, to help carry the bags, but he held back because deep down, he knew Sarah's trust couldn't be bought. It had to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, like mending fragile glass. But fate has a way of speeding up what the heart is too afraid to say. One evening, as Daniel lingered near the apartment, Alexander spotted him. The boy's eyes lit up and he ran straight to him, clutching the toy car in his small hands. "Hey, Mr. Daniel," Alexander called, his voice bright. Did you leave this to me?" Daniel froze. He glanced toward the window where Sarah stood watching, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. The truth was on the tip of his tongue, but instead, he knelt down to meet Alexander's eyes and smiled softly. "Maybe," he whispered, "maybe someone just wanted to make sure you kept smiling." Alexander laughed and hugged him without hesitation, his small arms wrapping around Daniel's neck. And in that moment, something inside Daniel broke open, something he had kept locked for far too long. Sarah watched from the window, her lips trembling. She wanted to stop this, to protect her son from the storm she knew was coming. Yet, as she saw Daniel holding Alexander, she couldn't ignore one undeniable truth. They already looked like family. Daniel never expected how quickly Alexander would gravitate toward him. What had started with a toy car and a chance hug soon became something more. Whenever Daniel came by the neighborhood, at first just to check if they were okay, Alexander always spotted him. The boy would dash down the steps, his golden hair bouncing in the sunlight, shouting, "Mr. Daniel! Mr. Daniel!" as though Daniel were the best part of his day. At first, Daniel tried to keep the visit short. A smile, a gentle pat on the boy's head, a few kind words before slipping away. But Alexander's laughter was magnetic. The boy's joy had a way of pulling him in, making the billionaire forget boardrooms and responsibilities. Soon, Daniel found himself staying longer. They played catch in the small courtyard behind the apartment. Alexander's little arm struggled to throw the ball far, but his determination made Daniel laugh. Sometimes they'd sit on the curb together. Daniel showed him how to whistle or fold paper airplanes. And every time Alexander smiled up at him, Daniel felt something stir inside. something both joyous and painful. It was like looking into a mirror of a life he might have had. Sarah watched all of this unfold with conflicted heart. She often stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, torn between stepping outside to stop it or letting it happen. Every laugh that echoed through the courtyard, every moment Alexander's small hand slipped into Daniel's, it made her chest ache. Part of her wanted to shield her son, to remind him that Daniel wasn't a permanent presence, that billionaires had lives too big and too complicated to stay. But another part, the part of her that remembered stolen kisses under the stars, whispered promises in their youth, and the boy Daniel used to be, couldn't look away. Late at night, when Alexander was asleep, Sarah found herself replaying the day in her mind. The way Daniel crouched down so Alexander could feel tall beside him. The way his eyes softened when Alexander laughed. The way he never once looked at his phone, as though nothing else mattered but the boy in front of him. It scared her, because it was too real, too genuine. One afternoon, after another round of laughter-filled games, Alexander tugged Daniel's hand. "Mr. Daniel, will you come inside? Mommy makes the best soup." Daniel hesitated. His heart thudded at the thought. He glanced toward the door, where Sarah stood in the frame, frozen, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes unreadable. For a moment, Daniel expected her to refuse, to shake her head, to tell him this was crossing a line. But to his surprise, Sarah stepped aside. "Dinner's almost ready," she said quietly, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Daniel followed Alexander inside, and suddenly the billionaire's polished world of glass towers and glittering chandeliers felt distant. The apartment was small, cozy, filled with warmth and the scent of homemade cooking. The kind of home that money couldn't buy. He sat at their modest table, watching as Alexander chattered away, telling stories between spoonfuls of soup. Daniel found himself laughing, real, unguarded laughter that hadn't touched his lips in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. But Sarah's heart was a battlefield. She served dinner, smiled faintly, listened to her son's chatter, but her eyes kept drifting to Daniel. Watching him at the table, she couldn't help but picture a life that might have been a life where Alexander wasn't just her son, but their son. Yet fear whispered in her ear. She couldn't forget the past, the heartbreak, the night she had cried alone. Could she really risk opening the door again? And Daniel, as much as he cherished his fragile closeness, he knew he was walking on dangerous ground. Each moment with Sarah and Alexander only deepened his longing. But one truth remained hidden in his chest, heavy and burning. Alexander wasn't just a boy he cared for. Alexander was his son. And Daniel knew it wouldn't stay a secret forever. The quiet of the evening settled over the small apartment. Alexander had finally drifted off to sleep, curled up under his blanket with his favorite stuffed bear, his golden hair spilling across the pillow. Daniel stood at the doorway, watching the boy with an expression that was both tender and tormented. It was a sight he wanted to remember forever, but one he knew came with questions Sarah would no longer allow to remain unspoken. When he turned, Sarah was there, leaning against the kitchen counter, her arms folded, her face shadowed by the dim light above. "Why are you here, Daniel?" Her voice was low, sharp, though trembling beneath the surface. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. Sarah's eyes burned into him. "You walk into our lives after years of silence, after everything. And what? Pretend you just happened to stop your car for a little boy on the street?" Her voice cracked at the last word. She swallowed hard, fighting for control. Daniel stepped forward, his chest tightening. "Sarah, I didn't plan this. I swear I didn't. But once I saw him, once I saw you, how could I walk away?" Her lips trembled, but her anger flared again. "You already walked away, Daniel. You did it once, and you don't get to do it again." The words sliced through the air. Daniel's jaw clenched, guilt flickering across his face. "You think I wanted that? You think leaving you was easy for me?" Sarah's eyes glistened. "You left without a word, without a reason. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" To us, silence hung heavy between them. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, the shallow breaths they both struggled to steady. Daniel lowered his gaze. "There were things I couldn't control back then. pressures, choices, mistakes I'll regret for the rest of my life. His voice broke, raw and unguarded. But never, never did I stop loving you. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat, her defenses faltering against the sincerity in his eyes. Part of her wanted to scream, to push him away, to remind herself of every tear she had shed because of him. But another part, the part that had never stopped aching for the boy she once loved, whispered to listen. She turned away, pressing her palms against the counter, as if holding herself upright. It doesn't matter now. It's too late. You don't get to walk back in and act like nothing happened. Daniel's steps were slow, hesitant, as he closed the distance between them. His voice was softer now. I don't want to act like nothing happened. I want to make it right. Her shoulders shook, but she didn't turn to face him. And what about Alexander? What happens when he gets attached to you, and you decide this is all too much? I won't let you break him the way you broke me. The mention of Alexander pierced Daniel like a blade. His lips parted, desperate to speak the truth, to finally say what burned inside him, that Alexander wasn't just a boy he cared about. He was his blood, his son, but fear held him back. He couldn't force it out. Not yet. So instead he whispered, I'm not going anywhere this time. Not from him. Not from you. Sarah turned then, her tear-streaked face lifting to meet his. For the first time in years, their eyes locked. Not as strangers, but as two people who had once belonged to each other. And though anger and pain still lingered, something else flickered beneath the surface. A fragile ember of the love they had once shared. Days passed quietly, yet the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Daniel had settled into a rhythm, helping Sarah from a distance, watching over Alexander, and quietly making small but meaningful changes in their lives. Every act of kindness, every visit, drew the boy closer to him, and in turn, drew Sarah's gaze more often. Alexander began asking questions. Innocent ones at first. Why do you always know when I need new shoes? Who sends the food, Mommy? Sarah smiled lightly, brushing the questions off with gentle, just some good neighbors. But inside, her heart wavered. The coincidences were too many, too precise, and she couldn't ignore the growing suspicion in her chest. Meanwhile, Daniel's connection with Alexander grew stronger. He taught him how to ride a bike, patiently running beside him, letting go only when he saw the boy gain balance. He read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices, coaxing laughter from Alexander even on days when his cough made him tired. Every laugh, every bright smile, pulled Daniel closer to a truth he had yet to reveal, the truth he feared would change everything. Alexander wasn't just a boy he loved, he was his son. One afternoon, Alexander tugged at Daniel's sleeve, eyes shining with curiosity. Mr. Daniel, sometimes I wish I had a daddy who played with me all the time, he said softly, looking down at his small hands. Daniel froze. His chest tightened. He wanted to pull Alexander into his arms, to tell him everything, but the words caught in his throat. Sarah, standing nearby and watching quietly, caught the conversation, her lips pressed together, a mixture of apprehension and protectiveness flickering across her face. She didn't want to see her son disappointed, but something in Daniel's eyes stopped her from stepping in. Instead, Daniel knelt down, voice soft but firm. I'm here now, Alexander, and I promise I'll always be around. The boy's face lit up, but question lingered in his mind, unspoken yet heavy. Why does he feel like my daddy, even though Mommy says he's not? That evening, Sarah sat by Alexander's bed as he drifted off to sleep. She watched Daniel quietly leave the room after story time, and for the first time, she felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to confront him, demand answers, remind herself of the heartbreak from the past. But another part, the part that had never stopped loving him, felt a subtle shift in her chest. Daniel was different now, kinder, patient, present, and Alexander's bond with him was undeniable. The mother in her feared the truth, even as her heart longed for it. And somewhere in the shadows of Daniel's mind, the secret of Alexander's parentage pressed heavier each day. He knew he couldn't hide it forever. The boy deserved the truth, and Sarah deserved to know the full story. But timing mattered. And Daniel feared that revealing it too soon might shatter the fragile trust they were just beginning to rebuild. The night was unusually still. A quiet blanket of darkness lay over the city, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic. Inside the apartment, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, Alexander curled up on a rug playing quietly with his toy cars, and Sarah stood near the window, her arms crossed, heart hammering with anticipation. Daniel had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but the words still felt like fire on his tongue. One misstep, one wrong tone, and he could lose everything he had worked so hard to protect. The fragile bond with Sarah, the trust he had earned with Alexander, and the chance to finally make things right. He took a deep breath, rising to his feet. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. Something important." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Important?" After all this time, Daniel, what could possibly be important enough to justify the years of silence? Daniel swallowed hard. He glanced at Alexander, who was looking up at him with innocent curiosity, oblivious to the storm about to break. "It's about Alexander." Sarah's hands gripped the window frame. Her chest tightened. "What about him?" Daniel knelt down to be at Alexander's level, his brown eyes locking with the boy's golden ones. "Alexander, I need you to listen carefully, okay?" Alexander nodded solemnly. "Okay." Daniel's voice trembled slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "You know how I've been helping you and your mommy? How I always make sure you have what you need, and why I spend so much time with you." The boy nodded again, frowning slightly in thought. "Yes, you're really nice to me." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "Alexander, I'm not just someone who wants to help. I'm your father. I'm your daddy." For a moment, the room was silent. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Alexander's wide blue eyes blinked rapidly, confusion and shock wrestling across his small face. "You your daddy?" the boy whispered, voice trembling. "But Mommy never said you were." Sarah stepped forward, tears brimming in her eyes. "Daniel," she said, her voice shaking, "why didn't you ever tell me?" Daniel looked at her, guilt and love mingling in his gaze. "I was scared. Scared I'd come back too late. Scared I'd hurt him by revealing the truth too soon, and I didn't know if he'd ever forgive me. But I couldn't hide it anymore. Alexander deserves to know who he is. And so do you, Sarah." Alexander's lip trembled. "You really my daddy?" His small arm shot out, wrapping around Daniel's neck in a hug so tight it took his breath away. Daniel hugged him back, tears welling in his brown eyes. "Yes, buddy, I've always been your daddy, and I'm here now. I won't ever leave again." Sarah watched them, her own tears flowing freely. Her heart ached from the years of pain and regret, but seeing Alexander in Daniel's arms, so certain and happy, something inside her shifted. The anger, the fear, the years of heartbreak, they were still there, but so was hope. "Daniel," she whispered, voice trembling, "this doesn't erase the past. But seeing him like this, seeing you like this..." Daniel gently took her hands in his. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I just want to be part of both your lives now. If you'll let me, I want to make up for lost time." Alexander squeezed Daniel's hand tightly. "Please, Mommy, can he stay? Can he be my daddy all the time?" Sarah took a deep breath, her blue eyes glistening. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes, we'll try. We'll see if we can all of us work through this together." Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest. Finally, after years of pain and separation, the first step toward healing had begun. The past was still there, old wounds, regrets, and mistakes. But now, the future felt possible. For the first time in years, Daniel, Sarah, and Alexander felt like a family, not perfect, but real, and ready to face whatever came next together. The morning sunlight spilled softly across the small apartment, illuminating the modest living room where Alexander sat at the table, eagerly arranging his toy cars. Daniel sat beside him, patiently guiding the boy's tiny hands as he built a makeshift racetrack. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. Her eyes softened as she saw them together, her son laughing freely, Daniel's brown hair falling into his eyes as he smiled. The room felt alive, infused with a warmth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It wasn't perfect. Daniel still hesitated before speaking to her directly, careful not to overstep. Sarah still flinched at old memories, at times letting her guard rise. But the small moments, the shared laughter, the gentle touches, the silent understanding a glance, were slowly bridging the gap years of distance had created. "Careful with that car, Alexander," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "We don't want it crashing into the table." Alexander giggled, his golden hair bouncing. "I can handle it, Daddy." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at the word. "Daddy," she murmured softly to herself, a mixture of awe and wonder crossing her features. Daniel caught her gaze, a faint, reassuring smile playing on his lips. He didn't need to speak. The message was clear. He wasn't going anywhere. Over the next few weeks, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt fragile yet promising. Daniel helped with the groceries, cooked meals, and played with Alexander every afternoon. Sarah, slowly, allowed herself to accept his presence, not as a replacement for what she had lost, but as a support, a partner, and a father figure her son had long deserved. One evening, they all sat on the small balcony, overlooking the city lights. Alexander leaned against Daniel's chest, sleepy but content. Sarah poured hot cocoa into small mugs, handing one to each of them. Daniel lifted his cup. "To new beginnings," he said softly. Sarah smiled, hesitating only a moment before raising her cup to meet his. "To trying," she replied, her voice tinged with emotion. Alexander clinked his small mug against theirs, his laughter filling the night air. "To family," he shouted proudly. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt whole. But healing wasn't just about happy moments. It was about confronting the shadows of the past. The missed birthdays, the harsh words unsaid, the loneliness each had endured. Sarah allowed herself to speak openly with Daniel about the years they had lost, the pain she had carried alone. And Daniel listened humbly without excuses, offering apologies that were simple but full of sincerity. "I'll never get those years back," Daniel said quietly one evening, "but I can be here now, for you, for Alexander, for us." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know, and I'm trying to let you in, Daniel. Slowly, but I want to try." And that was enough. Slowly, day by day, they began to stitch together the pieces of their lives. The bond between father and son grew stronger, and the tentative trust between Daniel and Sarah deepened, proving that love, patience, and forgiveness could begin to heal even the deepest wounds. The first weekend after the confession was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in years. Daniel insisted on taking Alexander to the park, while she stayed home to rest. But as she watched from a window, she couldn't help but smile at the sight of her son running toward Daniel, laughter spilling from his small body. "Catch me, Daddy," Alexander shouted, his golden hair shining in the sunlight. Daniel dropped to his knees, arms open wide, a grin on his handsome face. "I've got you, buddy. I've got you." The way Daniel moved with Alexander, gentle, playful, protective, was a sight Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from. Her chest ached in a way she hadn't expected, a mixture of love, nostalgia, and relief. By the time they returned home, Alexander was exhausted but happy, dragging Daniel by the hand. Sarah had dinner ready, and the three of them sat down together, a quiet intimacy settling over the small table. Days turned into weeks, and their lives slowly adjusted to this new reality. Daniel helped with bedtime routines, made Alexander laugh during homework, and even joined Sarah for errands, carrying bags or pushing the stroller when necessary. One evening, as the three of them walked along the riverside near their apartment, Alexander ran ahead, then turned back to Daniel with a bright smile. "Daddy, can we come here every weekend?" Daniel bent down, taking his son's small hand in his. "Of course, buddy. Every weekend, I promise." Sarah followed silently, her heart swelling. She had always imagined a life where Alexander grew up without his father, where she bore the weight alone. And now, watching Daniel with her son, she realized something profound. He wasn't just back. He was exactly what they both needed. That evening, as they settled in for the night, Sarah finally let herself relax in Daniel's presence. She sat on the couch, Alexander asleep between them, Daniel holding her hand gently. "You've done so much for us, Daniel," she whispered, her voice soft and tender. He squeezed her hand, his brown eyes glimmering with emotion. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Not for him, not for you." Sarah smiled faintly, a tear escaping down her cheek. "It feels like a miracle," she said. Daniel leaned closer, brushing a strand of her blonde hair behind her ear. "No miracle, just us finally getting the chance we always deserved." Alexander stirred in his sleep, mumbling softly, and both adults laughed quietly. For the first time, they felt the true weight of family. The comfort, the love, the promise that they could face anything together. The small apartment no longer felt cramped or limited. It felt alive, filled with laughter, love, and the quiet certainty that, despite the years lost and mistakes made, they were finally together. And in that moment, Daniel, Sarah, and Alexander knew something that money, power, or ambition could never buy. They had found what truly mattered: each other. The morning sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the small apartment. Alexander sat at the kitchen table, golden hair tousled, coloring in a picture he had drawn for his parents. Daniel stood behind him, brushing a smudge of crayon off the boy's cheek, his brown eyes soft with affection. "Careful there, buddy," Daniel said with a grin. "We don't want to turn the kitchen into an art gallery, at least not today." Alexander giggled, leaning into his father's touch. "But Daddy, I want to make it beautiful for you and Mommy." Sarah, standing nearby with a steaming cup of coffee, watched them quietly. Her blonde hair framed her face, her blue eyes glimmering with both happiness and a hint of disbelief. She could hardly believe how far they had come, from lost love and heartbreak to this simple, beautiful moment of togetherness. She walked over and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You've changed everything," she said softly. Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady. "No," he replied. "You've changed everything. For me, for Alexander, for all of us. I just had to come back." Alexander looked up at both of them, a small frown of curiosity on his face. "Are we really a family now?" Sarah knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers. "Yes, sweetheart, we're family, and we always will be." Daniel knelt on the other side, wrapping an arm around both of them. Alexander squealed with delight, wedging himself between them in a perfect little hug. For a moment, the apartment was filled with quiet laughter, warm sunlight, and the simple perfection of a family reunited. The mistakes of the past felt far away, replaced by hope, trust, and love that had been tested and proven strong. Days turned into weeks, and their life together blossomed. Daniel was no longer just a distant, successful man of his past. He was a father, a partner, and a presence that neither Sarah nor Alexander could imagine living without. They went apart together every weekend, cooked meals as a team, and celebrated small joys: a scraped knee, a good grade, a funny story Alexander had made up. Each moment built upon the last, weaving a tapestry of love, trust, and forgiveness that could never be torn apart. And though the past remained a shadow in their memories, it no longer controlled their present. They had found each other again, not as the people they were 12 years ago, but as the people they had grown to be, stronger, wiser, and ready to love without fear. One evening, as they sat on the balcony together, Alexander leaned against Daniel's chest, Sarah's hand resting gently on Daniel's shoulder. The city lights twinkled below, but nothing compared to the warmth of the little family above. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "For what?" Daniel asked, brushing a soft kiss across her temple. "For not giving up," she said. "For coming back. For all of this." Daniel smiled, his brown eyes reflecting the love he felt for both of them. "We didn't give up," he said. "We just found our way back." Alexander looked up, golden eyes shining. "I love you both," he said sincerely. And in that moment, Daniel and Sarah knew that every tear, every heartbreak, and every lost moment had led them to this. Love restored, family reunited, and a future they would face together. The past was behind them. The future was theirs. And they had learned the most important truth of all. Love, forgiveness, and family were worth fighting for, no matter how long it took. As the sun sets over their little apartment and laughter fills the air, one truth becomes clear. Love, forgiveness, and family can heal even the deepest wounds. Daniel, Sarah, and Alexander may have lost years, but they found each other again. And their story reminds us all that it's never too late to start anew. If this heartwarming story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV for more emotional journeys, incredible stories, and moments that will stay with you long after the video ends. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that touches a heart.